September 21, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 4 months, but for the 43 German women held at Camp Riverside in rural Pennsylvania, time seemed suspended in an uncertain limbo. They had been captured in the final chaotic weeks of the conflict, members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps who had served in communications, medical support, and administrative roles across occupied France. Now they awaited repatriation to a homeland many of them no longer recognized and weren't sure they wanted to see again. On this particular Saturday morning, something unprecedented happened. Captain Dorothy Mitchell, the American officer who commanded their facility, announced that the women would be transported to the nearby county fair. The prisoners exchanged confused glances, speaking in hushed German among themselves. Surely this was some kind of test or trick. Why would their captors take them to a public celebration? 24-year-old Liesel Hoffman stood near the back of the formation, her dark blonde hair pulled into the tight bun she had worn since joining the auxiliary 3 years earlier. She had learned to keep her expression neutral, her posture military, her expectations low. In her experience, anything unusual meant trouble. The trucks arrived at the fairgrounds an hour later, and as the women climbed down from the vehicles, they were struck by sounds and sights that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Children's laughter rang through the air, bright banners fluttered in the September breeze, the smell of popcorn and roasted nuts drifted across the grounds. And everywhere, there was color and light and movement that spoke of abundance rather than scarcity. Captain Mitchell walked ahead of the group with Sergeant Thomas Bradford at her side. She had insisted that the women not be restrained or obviously guarded, wanting them to experience the fair as displaced persons rather than enemy prisoners. It was a controversial decision that had required approval from her superiors in Washington, but she believed these women deserved to see what American peacetime looked like. As they entered the main fairway, Liesel noticed a vendor's stand unlike anything she had ever seen. A middle-aged man in a striped apron was spinning something that looked like pink clouds onto paper cones. Children clustered around him, each clutching their own impossibly fluffy creation. The substance seemed to float, defying gravity and logic in equal measure. 19-year-old Helene Fisher, the youngest of their group, grabbed Liesel's arm. "What is that?" she whispered in German. "It looks like colored air." Greta Schultz, who had studied some English before the war, moved closer to read the hand-painted sign above the stand. She turned back to the others, her face confused. "It says cotton candy," she translated slowly. "But that makes no sense. Cotton is not food, and candy is—" She trailed off, unable to reconcile the words with what she was seeing. Captain Mitchell had noticed the women's fascination. She approached the vendor and purchased 10 portions, then turned to offer them to the German prisoners. With a gentle smile that seemed to say something her words did not. Liesel's mind traveled back to the winter of 1944, to the cramped administrative office in Strasbourg, where she had worked as a communications coordinator. The building had been cold, perpetually cold, despite the small stove they were allowed to use for 2 hours each evening. Her rations by then had been reduced to barely enough to sustain basic function. A thin slice of dark bread in the morning, watery soup at midday, and perhaps a small portion of turnips in the evening if supplies lasted. The other women in her unit had learned not to talk about food. Conversations about meals they remembered from before the war only made the hunger worse, made their stomachs clench with longing for things that no longer existed in their world. But late at night, when exhaustion made their discipline slip, someone would always whisper about their mother's apple strudel or their grandmother's Christmas cookies, and the others would listen with tears in their eyes. Margaret Klein, who had been a nurse before her capture, used to tell them that the body could adapt to almost anything. She explained in her calm, clinical way how their metabolism was slowing, how their bodies were learning to survive on less. But she couldn't explain why their commanders still wore well-fitted uniforms while the women's clothes hung loose on their shrinking frames. The propaganda broadcasts they were required to listen to during their shift spoke of Germany's inevitable victory, of the superior strength and determination of the Reich. But the broadcasts never explained why victory looked like starvation, why triumph felt like weakness that made their hands shake when they tried to type reports or operate radio equipment. Liesel remembered the day they received news that rations would be cut again. Helene, just 18 then, had quietly fainted at her desk. When they revived her, she apologized repeatedly, ashamed of her weakness, terrified she would be reported for unreliability. They had all covered for her, all lied in their reports, because they understood that any one of them could be next. The older women, like Ursula Becker, who was 26 and had worked in supply coordination, sometimes managed to secure extra bread crusts or potato peels. She distributed these treasures with the gravity of someone handling precious jewels, making sure the youngest women received slightly larger portions. It was a small act of rebellion against regulations, a quiet assertion that their humanity mattered more than the rules. By March of 1945, even the officers stopped pretending things were going according to plan. The Allied forces were advancing, and everyone could hear the artillery. Growing closer each day, Liesel had watched her commanding officer burn documents, his hands moving with frantic urgency as he destroyed evidence of operations that would never be completed. When the Americans finally arrived in April, Liesel's first coherent thought had been relief that she might finally eat something substantial. Her second thought had been terror about what Americans did to their prisoners. The propaganda had been very specific about that, very graphic, very frightening. She had been taught that American soldiers were barbaric, that they showed no mercy to captured enemies, particularly to women who had served the Reich. Standing now in the Pennsylvania sunshine, holding a paper cone with an impossible pink cloud attached to it, Liesel felt the full weight of how thoroughly she had been deceived. Liesel held the paper cone at arm's length, as if the pink substance might somehow harm her. Around her, the other German women stood frozen in similar poses of uncertainty. The cotton candy looked impossibly delicate, like something that shouldn't exist in the real world. It reminded Liesel of the cloud she used to watch as a child in Bavaria, lying in summer grass without a care beyond what her mother might prepare for dinner. Helene was the first to move. The youngest among them had always been the bravest in small ways, even when caution might have served her better. She lifted the cotton candy slowly to her face, her nose wrinkling as she tried to understand what she was smelling. Sweet, certainly, but unlike any sweet she had encountered before. Her finger extended tentatively, barely making contact with the spun sugar. Her eyes widened. "It's disappearing," she whispered in German, watching as the spot where her finger had touched simply melted away into nothing. "I barely touched it, and it vanished." The other women leaned closer, fascinated, despite their instinctive wariness. Greta reached out next, pressing her fingertip into her own portion. The sugar dissolved instantly against her skin, leaving a sticky residue that she brought to her lips without thinking. Her expression transformed from suspicion to wonder in a single moment. Captain Mitchell stood several feet away, watching the scene with an expression that Sergeant Bradford couldn't quite interpret. She had seen many things in her 3 years of military service, but watching enemy prisoners discover cotton candy for the first time hadn't been among her expectations when she accepted this assignment. The German women were beginning to taste their portions now, each one approaching the experience with the solemnity of a scientific experiment. Liesel finally brought the pink cloud to her lips. The sugar touched her tongue and dissolved instantly into pure sweetness, a flavor so intense and uncomplicated that it seemed to erase everything else for just a moment. No bitterness, no complexity, just simple sweetness that required nothing from her except the willingness to experience it. Margaret, always the practical one, was studying her cotton candy with a nurse's analytical eye. "How is this made?" she asked in careful English, directing her question to Private Daniel Cooper, who had accompanied them from the camp It feels like air, like eating a sweet cloud. Cooper, a farm boy from Nebraska, who had never expected to be explaining American fair food to German prisoners, scratched his head. Well, ma'am, it's just sugar that's been heated up and spun real fast. Makes these thin threads that stick together. My little sister loves it. Gets it every year at the state fair back home. Just sugar, Liesl thought. Just sugar spun into something beautiful and frivolous and completely unnecessary for survival. She looked around at her fellow prisoners, all of them holding their cotton candy with a delicacy that went beyond mere carefulness. They were holding it like something precious, something that might disappear if they weren't gentle enough. Which, she realized, was exactly what it did. It disappeared the moment you tried to hold onto it too tightly, leaving only sweetness behind. Ursula Becker had not cried since her capture 6 months earlier. She had maintained the composure expected of someone who had coordinated supply operations for an entire regiment. But standing in the middle of an American county fair, watching a child no older than 7 casually discard half-eaten cotton candy into a waste bin, she felt tears burning behind her eyes. The waste, the casual, thoughtless waste of something so sweet and beautiful. That discarded portion represented more sugar than Ursula had seen in a single place during the last year of the war. They give this to children, Greta said quietly in German, her voice carrying an edge of something between awe and anger. For fun, not for nutrition or survival, just for enjoyment at a fair. Liesl watched American families strolling past their group. Mothers pushed infants in carriages. Fathers hoisted toddlers onto their shoulders. Teenagers clustered together laughing at private jokes. None of them looked hungry. None of them had the hollow-eyed wariness that Liesl saw every morning when she looked at her fellow prisoners. None of them moved with the careful economy of motion that came from having too little energy to waste on unnecessary movement. The propaganda told us Americans were suffering, Helene said, her young voice confused and small. They said American children were starving because of the war, that their cities were being bombed into rubble, that their people were turning against their government. She gestured helplessly at the scene before them. But look at this. Look at all of this. Captain Mitchell had been watching the women's reactions carefully. She approached Liesl, who had emerged as the informal spokesperson for the group. I know this must be difficult to process, she said gently. The contrast between what you were told and what was. You're seeing. Liesl met the American captain's eyes directly. We were taught that you were monsters, she said in her heavily accented but clear English. That you tortured prisoners, that you celebrated suffering, that you were barely civilized. She held up the remaining wisps of her cotton candy. Monsters do not make clouds out of sugar for their children. Monsters do not share such things with their enemies. Margaret had been doing calculations in her head, the way she always did when confronted with something she needed to understand. The sugar in just one of these, she said slowly, would have been a week's ration for a family in Germany last winter, maybe more. And here, children eat them and throw them away, half-finished. The realization settling over the women was visible in their postures, in the way their military bearing began to crack. They had served a regime that starved its own people while promising victory. They had believed in a cause that had asked them to sacrifice everything while their leaders hoarded resources. And now they stood in the land of their supposed enemies, watching those enemies spin sugar into frivolous delights for children who had never known hunger. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. Captain Mitchell led the group deeper into the fairgrounds, and with each step the women encountered new impossibilities. A booth sold fresh apples piled high in wooden crates, their red skins gleaming in the afternoon sun. Another offered roasted corn on the cob, butter melting down the golden kernels. Children ran past clutching candied apples, the glossy red coating catching the light. Liesl found herself counting without meaning to. 12 apples in the front row of that crate alone. Multiply that by the visible crates, and there were hundreds of apples, just sitting there, available to anyone with a few coins. In Strasbourg, during her final winter there, A single apple had been a treasure worth trading a week's cigarette ration for, and even then, you had to know someone who knew someone. "Look at their clothes," Ursula murmured, nodding toward a family passing by. The mother wore a clean floral dress with a matching hat. The father's shirt was pressed and whole, no patches or repairs visible. The two children had shoes that fit properly, coats that looked new. No one is wearing mended clothes. No one looks like they've had to make do. Greta had stopped in front of a game booth where children threw balls at stacked bottles, trying to win stuffed animals. She watched a boy of perhaps 10 years old, his face scrunched in concentration as he missed his target. His father laughed, ruffled the boy's hair, and paid for another round. The casualness of it, the easy way the father handed over coins for something that served no purpose beyond entertainment, struck Greta as almost obscene in its abundance. They passed a livestock exhibition where farmers displayed their finest cattle, pigs, and sheep. The animals were fat, healthy, their coats glossy with good nutrition. Helene, who had grown up on a small farm outside Munich, felt something twist in her chest. She remembered her family's cow, how thin it had become by 1944, how her father had wept quietly when they finally had to slaughter it because there wasn't enough feed to keep it alive through another winter. These American animals looked better fed than most German soldiers had been during the final year of the war. Private Cooper, walking alongside the women, seemed uncomfortable with their silence. "You folks doing all right?" he asked, his Midwestern accent softening the words. "I know it's probably pretty overwhelming. My first county fair was overwhelming too, and I grew up just 20 miles from here." Margaret turned to him, her expression serious. "Private Cooper, please understand. We are not overwhelmed by the fair itself. We are overwhelmed by what the fair represents. This abundance, this waste, this casual joy. We fought a war while our people starved, believing we were fighting against enemies who wanted to destroy us. But you were here, living like this the entire time." A band began playing in the distance, the bright notes of a brass section carrying across the fairgrounds. American families drifted toward the music pavilion, children skipping ahead of their parents. The German women followed at a distance, a small cluster of gray uniformed foreigners moving through a celebration they didn't feel part of, watching a life they had been taught to despise, but now found themselves unable to look away from. Sarah Walsh had been watching the German women since they arrived. At 12 years old, she possessed the unselfconscious curiosity of someone too young to fully understand why these foreign women should be feared or hated. Her mother, Eleanor Walsh, had been one of the local volunteers who convinced Captain Mitchell that bringing the prisoners to the fair might help with their eventual reintegration into civilian life, though everyone understood that reintegration would happen in Germany, not America. Sarah approached the group while her mother was occupied speaking with the captain. She held a fresh cone of cotton candy, pink and impossibly fluffy, and walked directly up to Helene, who looked closest to her own age, though the German girl was actually 19. "Would you like some?" Sarah asked, holding out the cotton candy. "I saw you finished yours already." Helene stared at the offering, uncertain how to respond. The other women had gone quiet, watching this interaction with the intensity of people trying to decipher a test they hadn't studied for. Finally, Helene reached out and took a small piece, her fingers barely pinching the spun sugar. "Thank you," she managed in English, the words heavily accented but clear. Sarah smiled. "You speak English pretty good. Did you learn in school?" Helene nodded. "Some, before the war, but I have forgotten much." She paused, searching for words. "You are not afraid of us?" The question seemed to genuinely puzzle Sarah. "Afraid? Why would I be afraid? My mom says you're just people who got caught up in something bad, like when Tommy Henderson's whole family got in trouble because his dad made some bad choices. Tommy's not bad just because his dad was." Liesel had been listening to this exchange, marveling at the child's simple moral clarity. Adults complicated everything with history and politics and grudges, but this girl saw only what was in front of her, people who needed kindness. Your mother sounds very wise, Liesel said, joining the conversation. Sarah turned her attention to this new speaker. Are you their leader or something? You stand like my teacher does when she's in charge. The observation made several of the German women smile despite themselves. Something like that, Liesel admitted. I try to help when I can. What's Germany like, Sarah asked, her curiosity apparently boundless. Is it pretty? Do you have fairs like this? The question opened something in Helene that had been locked tight since her capture. Germany was beautiful once, she said softly. My family had a farm, green fields, mountains in the distance. We had a festival every autumn with music and dancing. Before the war, before everything changed. Her voice caught slightly. I do not know what it looks like now. I have not been home in 2 years. Sarah processed this information with the seriousness it deserved. That must be really hard. I'd be so sad if I couldn't go home for 2 years. Do you miss your family? Around them, several of the German women had to look away. The child's innocent questions were landing in places that military interrogations had never reached. Yes, Helene whispered, every day. Eleanor Walsh had noticed her daughter speaking with the prisoners and approached, not with alarm, but with interest. She had spent months advocating for these women to be treated with dignity, believing that mercy was not weakness, but strength. The barracks were quiet that night, but no one was sleeping. Liesel lay on her cot staring at the ceiling, listening to the restless movements of 42 other women who were similarly unable to find peace. The cotton candy had dissolved hours ago, but its sweetness lingered in their memories, a physical reminder of everything they had seen and could not unsee. Finally, Margaret sat up and lit the single lamp they were permitted after lights out for emergencies. We need to talk about this, she said quietly in German. We cannot pretend today didn't happen. One by one, the other women rose from their cots, gathering in the center of the barracks as they had done countless times before, when they needed to make sense of something that defied easy understanding. Ursula spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years managing logistics and supplies. I kept counting, she admitted. Everything I saw, I was calculating how much it would have meant to us in Germany. The apples alone from that one vendor could have fed a small village for a week. The corn, the meat, the sugar, all of it just available, just there for anyone who wanted it. The children, Helene said, her young face looking older in the dim lamplight. Did you see how they ran, how they laughed? They were not afraid. They did not flinch at loud noises. They did not have that look we all had, that watching, waiting look of people expecting the next bad thing. Greta, who had been silent since their return, finally spoke. We were taught that Americans were weak because they valued comfort over duty, that their abundance made them soft and unworthy. But I think we were taught this because our leaders did not want us to know the truth. What truth? Asked another woman, Clara Zimmerman, who had worked in communications alongside Liesel. That we were starving while fighting people who had enough to spin sugar into toys for children? That we were told sacrifice was noble while our enemies were proving that prosperity was possible? Liesel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the American camp that held them. The truth that we were lied to about everything, not just small lies or propaganda exaggerations, everything. What America was, what Americans wanted, why we were fighting, what we were fighting for, all of it was lies built on lies. Margaret, ever the practical one, pushed further. So what do we do with this knowledge? We will be sent home soon, back to Germany, back to people who still believe the lies we believed. Do we tell them what we saw? Do we try to make them understand? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Several women shifted uncomfortably. To speak against the Reich, even a defeated Reich, felt dangerous in ways that went beyond rational thought. Years of conditioning did not dissolve as easily as spun sugar on the tongue. They will not believe us, Ursula said flatly. If we tell them about cotton candy and county fairs and fat cattle, they will think we were corrupted by American propaganda. They will say we betrayed our country by believing enemy lies." Helene's voice was small but steady. "But what if the real betrayal was believing our own country's lies? What if we betrayed ourselves by not questioning sooner?" Captain Mitchell had provided the women with paper and pencils, encouraging them to write to family members in Germany if they wished. The International Red Cross was slowly re-establishing mail routes through the occupied zones, though delivery was uncertain at best. Most of the women had taken the supplies gratefully, desperate for any connection to the lives they had left behind. But now, sitting with blank paper in front of them, they found themselves paralyzed by an impossible question. What truth could they tell? Liesel had started 7 different letters to her mother in Bavaria. Each time, she got no further than a few sentences before crossing them out and starting over. "Dear Mutti, I am well and hope this letter finds you safe," she wrote, the standard opening feeling hollow and inadequate. "Yesterday, the Americans took us to something called a county fair." She paused, pencil hovering over the paper. How could she describe what she had seen without sounding like she had lost her mind? How could she explain the cotton candy without making it sound like a fairy tale? She tried again. "The Americans have more food than I have seen in years. Children here waste sugar that would have kept us alive for weeks." She read it back and grimaced. It sounded bitter, accusatory, like she was blaming her mother for the deprivation they had all endured. She crossed it out. Across the barracks, Greta was having similar struggles. She had written and rewritten the same paragraph 4 times. "Dear Papa, I need you to understand something important. Everything we were told about America was wrong. They are not monsters. They are not barbaric. They have treated us with more kindness than our own officers showed us in the final months." But reading it back, she could imagine her father's reaction. He had been a loyal party member since 1933, a true believer who had sent his daughter to serve the Reich with pride. Would he see her letter as evidence that she had been brainwashed? Would he think the Americans had broken her somehow? Helene was crying quietly as she tried to write to her younger sister. "Dear Anneliese, I saw children today who looked like you, but healthy and happy and safe. They ate candy made from spun sugar, something I did not know existed. They laughed without fear. They ran without purpose except joy. I want this for you. I want this for all of us. But I do not know how to make you understand what I have learned." Margaret had given up on writing home entirely. Instead, she was composing something different, a detailed account of their experiences, written with clinical precision, documenting everything they had witnessed. "This is not for now," she explained to Ursula, who was reading over her shoulder. "This is for later, for when people are ready to hear it. Maybe 10 years from now, maybe 20. But someone needs to write down what we saw, what we learned." Ursula nodded slowly. She had abandoned her own letter home and was instead writing a list of questions she could not answer. Why did we believe we were superior when we had less? Why did we think sacrifice was noble when others proved abundance was possible? Why did we trust leaders who starved us while promising victory? Private Cooper made his evening rounds, checking on the barracks as required. He noticed the women hunched over their papers, many with tear-stained faces, and felt a wave of sympathy he had not expected to feel for enemy prisoners. His own letters home to Nebraska had become complicated too, trying to explain to his parents and his fiancée that the German women were not what he had expected, that war was more complex than the newsreel suggested. 3 weeks after the county fair, Captain Mitchell announced another excursion. This time, a local church group had invited the German women to a harvest dinner in town. The response from the prisoners was mixed. Some, like Liesel, had begun to cautiously embrace these opportunities to see more of American life. Others remained wary, convinced that eventual punishment or betrayal was inevitable. The dinner was held in the basement of St. Mark's Lutheran Church, a modest building with white clapboard siding and a tall steeple. Eleanor Walsh had organized everything, insisting to her fellow parishioners that Christian charity meant more than words on Sunday mornings. When the German women entered, They found long tables covered in white cloths, laden with food that made several of them stop in their tracks. Roasted turkey, golden and glistening, bowls of mashed potatoes with butter melting into small pools, green beans with almonds, fresh bread still warm, sliced thick, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes with marshmallows, and 3 different kinds of pie for dessert. It was more food than most of the women had seen in a single place since before the war began. The American families were already seated, and they stood as the German women entered, not in hostility, but in welcome. An older man, introduced as Pastor William Henderson, offered a brief prayer that asked for peace, understanding, and healing for all nations. His words were simple but sincere, and several of the German women found tears in their eyes before he finished. Sarah Walsh had saved a seat next to her for Helene, waving enthusiastically when she spotted the young German woman. "I told everyone you were coming," she said excitedly. "My friends wanted to meet you." Helene found herself surrounded by curious American teenagers who asked about Germany, about her life before the war, about whether she had ever seen the Alps. Their questions were innocent, genuine, unmarked by hatred or suspicion. As the meal progressed, conversations began to flow more freely. Greta found herself talking with a farmer about agricultural techniques. Margaret discussed nursing practices with the church's volunteer medical coordinator. Ursula, always practical, was learning about American approaches to community organization from Eleanor Walsh. But it was a small moment between Liesel and an elderly woman named Dorothy Bergen that captured the evening's significance. Mrs. Bergen had lost her son at Normandy just 16 months earlier. She knew Liesel was German, knew that people like Liesel had been on the other side when her son died. Yet she reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over Liesel's younger one. "My Henry would have wanted me to be here tonight," she said quietly. "He wrote to me before he died that he hoped when the war ended we would remember that German soldiers had mothers too, that they were somebody's sons." Liesel could not speak. She could only nod, tears streaming down her face, as this woman who had every reason to hate her chose forgiveness instead. Around them, 42 other German women were learning the same impossible lesson, that their enemies were capable of a kindness their own leaders had never shown them. December 5, 1945. The repatriation orders finally arrived. The German women would board a transport ship in 10 days, bound for Bremen and whatever remained of their former lives. Captain Mitchell posted the notice in the barracks, and the women gathered around it in silence, reading the bureaucratic language that would carry them back across the ocean to a country many of them is no longer recognized as home. Liesel sat on her cot that evening, holding a small paper bag that Eleanor Walsh had given her the previous week. Inside were 6 pieces of hard candy wrapped in colored paper. "For your journey," Eleanor had said, "something sweet to remember us by." It was not cotton candy, could never be cotton candy, but Liesel understood the symbolism. Sweetness that lasted, that could survive the journey, that would not dissolve at the first touch. The women had changed in ways that went beyond their improved health, and the weight they had gained on American rations. They moved differently now, spoke differently, carried themselves with something that looked less like military discipline and more like genuine dignity. They had learned that strength did not require cruelty, that abundance did not mean weakness, that kindness was not the same as surrender. Helene had received a letter from her sister in Bavaria. The news was grim. Their farm was gone, destroyed in the fighting. Their father was dead, killed in the final weeks of the war. Their mother was alive but living in a displaced persons camp, waiting for housing assignments in the Soviet zone. Reading it, Helene had wept, but not with the hopeless despair she might have felt months earlier. She wept with understanding that grief and hope could exist simultaneously. "We will tell them," Margaret announced during their final evening together. "When we return, when people ask what it was like to be prisoners in America, we will tell them the truth." Ursula nodded. "They may not believe us. They may think we were corrupted or brainwashed." Greta finish the thought. But we will tell them anyway. About the cotton candy, about the harvest dinner, about the woman who lost her son but still chose forgiveness. We owe that much to everyone who did not survive to learn what we learned. Liesl thought about Sarah Walsh, about Private Cooper, about Captain Mitchell, who had risked her career to show enemy prisoners basic human dignity. She thought about the cotton candy dissolving on her tongue, that moment of pure sweetness that had somehow contained a revelation about everything she had believed and everything she had been taught. The lies had dissolved too, just as quickly, just as completely, leaving behind a truth that was harder to hold, but infinitely more valuable. On the morning they boarded the trucks to begin their journey home, each woman carried more than just her few possessions. They carried the memory of unexpected kindness, of abundance shared freely, of enemies who had proven to be better friends than their own leaders had ever been. They carried the sweetness and the bittersweet truth that came with it, and they carried it home.